Hello. This is the first time I've ever done a recorded video talk. I hope it works out okay. I'm sitting in our little conservatory and the plant growing out of my head is called Stephanotis. A lovely plant if it gets blossom on it. Wonderful perfume. But to work. Our title is Living as God's People When We're Treated Badly. Living as God's People When We're Treated Badly. And our reading, we've heard already, is 1 Peter 3, 8-22. Now, do we want to be treated badly? Ooh, I don't think so. Do we like it? Not at all. Can we avoid it? Maybe, sometimes. Can we always be sure we can avoid it? Probably not. But Peter helps us because he faces the problem clearly and gives us important guidelines about how we should respond. First, he tells us to be positive, what we should be like. We're called to be like-minded, sympathetic, loving one another, compassionate and humble, not repaying wrong done to us or said about us with the same back, but rather with blessing. And I think this helps us because if we're like that, firstly, that is our calling as followers of Christ. But I think we are less likely to be badly treated. Now, of course, thinking of being like that means that we could be not like it. And sometimes we're not like that. Sometimes maybe we do bring opposition and criticism on ourselves. And sometimes we really need friends who love us enough to point out where we are wrong. It's called tough love, I think, isn't it? And this, of course, is where the humility that Peter talks about comes in. If we're not humble, we won't receive that kind of thing, that kind of correction. And when we find that we do need that, and somebody's warned us, or we've realised it for ourselves, we must ask forgiveness and make amends where we can. So be sure you're not dealing with others in ways that will cause resentment and hurt. Deal with others as Christ dealt with others, because we're called to be like him. And Peter then goes on to say, who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? Well, I suppose the answer is actually quite a lot of people. And for some Christians, that harm will amount to imprisonment or even death. But Peter did recognise this might happen. Paul tells us also, Romans 12:18 this is, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Paul warns us that we must do our best to be in harmonious and peaceful relationships with others, so that even if things do break down and there is bad treatment or harsh words, at least we've tried our best. Sometimes we really are trying to do this, to be the people that Peter and Paul encourage us to be, and yet we are still attacked, falsely accused, or slandered. So then what? Well, Peter tells us, but even if you do suffer for what is right, you are blessed. How are you blessed? By being treated badly. That seems crazy. Well, I think part of the answer to that is because we're following in the footsteps of Christ. That's what happened to him. So let's be like him in how we behave and what we say. Be ready to humbly but clearly state what following Christ means to you. Maybe we should practice this. So if a conversation goes into the area of a faith journey, we're clear on what we can truly say about our own faith journey as followers of Christ. So who might treat us badly? Well, could be people we've got no prior knowledge of. We don't know who. I mean, how many of you have been burgled? Yeah? How many of you have been wrongly criticised or harmed in some other way? have you had your car, say, vandalised or even stolen by somebody you never knew? Now, for some Christians in different parts of the world, the harm actually is worse than having your car stolen. It can be sudden and violent. But Peter is telling us, if we are treated badly, don't be surprised. 'Twas ever thus. Christ first, then our brothers and sisters, and maybe now us. But sometimes those who harm us can be those who we do have a prior relationship with. It could be family, friends, other Christians, even members of our own Christian fellowship. Again, 'twas ever thus. Go back 3 millennia and read some of the Psalms. Here's one. Psalm 41 verse 9 says, "Even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me." Psalm 55:12 says, "If an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were rising against me, I could hide. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship in the house of God as we walked about among the worshippers." Psalm 35 is an extended version of this experience. Have a look. And actually this really matters if it's others, perhaps other Christians who are harming us. Some of you will know Glyn and Emma Morton. You may remember they came and spoke to us about their ministry and their life in St Ethelburgers. It was the occasion where they put a hat with a crow sitting on the top of it on my head, if that strikes a chord. And they have an extraordinary ministry with people who have neo-pagan spiritualities, even Wicca, which is a type of witchcraft. And they have an extraordinary way of contacting them in the name of Christ and befriending them. Now, Emma told me that around 90% of the people they met in neo-pagan circles have had prior contact with the church or Christians in one way or another, and that many have been wounded and hurt and damaged in those contacts, and so they've looked elsewhere to find a spiritual path. Have you seen people wounded or hurt by the church and its people? Has that happened to you? That should never be. Here's another example. Killing of Christians during the Reformation. Wow. In England, this is. If you Google how many Protestants were killed in England during the Reformation, Wikipedia tells you that there were probably 287, including 56 women. But you know, if you Google something like that, you get a list, don't you? A series of hits, as it were, you can look at. That's the first one. The second one, right next to it, is headed List of Catholic Martyrs of the English Reformation. And there are 359 names recorded. These things should never be, should never have been. Now, how are we going to respond, however, if we are badly treated by someone we don't know even, or maybe someone we do know? Just a reminder, firstly, make sure it's not you, in part at least, that you're not drawing opposition and hostility towards yourself. We need to be sure we've not wronged someone else and we're just getting it back. And if that is the case, remember, we must ask forgiveness and make amends where we can. And that, of course, brings us on to my second way of responding. It is, of course, the F word, forgiveness. What are we to do at the end of the day? We're to follow the example of Christ. Remember when he was hauled up before the Roman governor, Pilate said repeatedly, "I find no fault in this man. I certainly see no cause for the death penalty here." But on the cross, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Nicky Gumbel, least I think it was Nicky Gumbel, somebody anyway, certainly said this. They said, unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Why did they say that? Because unforgiveness, if we hold that, that works like a poison within us. It damages and hurts us. Claire and I actually went to a series of meetings, teaching meetings at Glindley Manor, LL Ministries Centre near just back of Eastbourne. And I remember still very clearly an example of this, which someone gave as an illustration. Firstly, he got someone to come up who was a stooge or a friend, who he could bring into this example he was going to give us. And he said, here is Joe, or whatever his name was. And of course, I'm holding things against him. Now, of course, he wasn't, but this was the illustration. And he said, I'm going to write these things that I'm holding against him down. And he got a piece of paper, and he wrote all these things that he was holding against Joe. And then he said, okay, Joe, I want you to stand here, and I'm going to hold this list of things against you. And he literally did that. He put the piece of paper on the guy's back and held it there with his hand. Because we talk about that, don't we? We talk about holding something against one. Well, he literally did this. And then he said to Joe, okay, will you just walk around the room a little bit? Just, to and fro a little bit. And he followed him. And he had his hand on his back, holding these things against him. He wasn't going to let this go. But who was in control there? Who was guiding? Who was dominating? Who was leading? Who was in charge? It was Joe, wasn't it? And how was the person who'd been wronged, who had this list of things he was holding against Joe, how was he to be freed of that? To do simply that. Take his hand away. And the list of things, of course, fell to the floor and disappeared. And that's what God is calling us to do. To forgive. So important. In our Zoom house group, which has worked well, actually, I think, we've been looking at some short videos from an organisation called the Bible Project. They're American, but actually really good. In fact, when I mentioned this to Matthew, he said, oh, yes, we used to use that at Oak Hill Theological College for revision before exams. So I thought, oh, in that case, it must be all right. They're on YouTube. They are free. And they're about different books of the Bible and big themes in the Bible and how it all fits together. Have a look, really helpful. But we looked in our Zoom group into their little video and their guidance, their comments on the book of Proverbs, And you remember all those Proverbs, sort of one-liners, and loads of them, aren't there, in the middle of the book? What are they? Are they promises? Are they guarantees saying, if you do this, this will always happen? Actually, no, they're not. And the phrase that they used in the Bible Project video, which was really helpful and stuck in my mind, was that these are the accumulated wisdom of the ages. The accumulated wisdom of the ages. Now, we have a proverb writer in our family. Well, we had, she's died now. Claire's great-grandmother, Bertha Thompson, known as Big Granny. She went out to India immediately before the First World War to get married and had a family there, and eventually they came back between the wars. But in the language which they used for great granny there, it was big granny. And of course, by the time we had our children, she was indeed great granny. So we always called her Big Granny. And she had a saying about this, about how to respond when we're treated badly. And she said this, think nothing of it, dear. Pass lightly over it. Now, one of the Proverbs you could look at, Proverbs 12:16, says this, fools show their annoyance at once, but the prudent overlook an insult. The prudent overlook an insult. Kind of the same thing as Big Granny was saying, but I actually prefer Big Granny's style. Think nothing of it, dear. Pass lightly over it. You have to keep the dear in, otherwise it couldn't have been Big Granny, because that's how she always talked. But it's always like this saying, that we should never respond. It doesn't mean we shouldn't sometimes point wrong out, of course, particularly if it's to the disadvantaged, the poor, the stranger, the foreigner. The Bible's full, time and time again, saying we should care for those people. And if we see that not happening, then we're entitled to say, "Hey, that's not right." So here we are. We have the accumulated wisdom of the ages. Remember, we're to forgive, but sometimes it's think nothing of it, dear. Pass lightly over it. And just to finish, I think the most important words I could think of that related this topic are Christ's words in the Sermon on the Mount on Matthew chapter 5, where he said this: "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kind of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets